Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting to present a little bit of my work. Today, we'll be talking about seed dispersal networks in novel ecosystems in Hawaii. And I have to start by thanking all the people involved in the project, as well as the institutions. So the principal investigators, which were the minds behind the entire project, the grad students who did part of their thesis with this data and helped us to collect this data, our crew leaders and the small army of people who collect the data in the field or helped us in the lab, our partners on Oahu, and the funding agents, especially the US Department of Defense, which funded most of this work. So today I'll be talking about results that we present essentially in these two papers with some additions. So in the first part, I'll talk about interactions at the community level, so how interactions are organized. And in the second part, I will focus more on the species. So which are the most important species in the community and why they play key roles for these networks. So when most of us think about Hawaii, we think about this gorgeous nature, an amazing place to visit with these awesome mountains, beautiful beaches, and lava flowing from active volcanoes and hitting the ocean, forming these stones. Or we think about the surfing or the exotic cultures that are present with the people originally from there. And because of these and other reasons, probably Hawaii is one of the main destinations that people will think when they're asked about where they want to go to spend time. And because of that, Hawaii is indeed visited by many people. So in 2019, over 10 million people visited the Hawaiian Archipelago. And only in Oahu, there is almost a million inhabitants. So it's the place where people want to live when they retire too. And of course, if you have a place like this, with all these things that attract people, they indeed attract people. And if you need people, you need infrastructure for them and for their activities. So Hawaii is, despite this idea of a pristine tropical paradise, it's quite modified by human activity. And of course, when people go there, they take with them some introduced species or species that will become sometimes invasive. So Hawaii is one of the most isolated archipelagos in the planet. It's 3,700 kilometers from the North American coast and 8,500 kilometers from South American coast, 6,000 kilometers from Asia, and 5,700 kilometers from Australia. And because this is super isolated, it also has a low probability of species to colonize there. And when they get there, they're isolated and pretty much will become new species because they don't leave the archipelago. And Hawaii then is formed by these 8 main islands, which are all more recent. And if we look the entire archipelago, there is this chronos sequence where in islands to the west, they were formed first, so they're older. They're about 29 million years old. And then as you go to west, you have very recent islands that were formed more recently. And both because of the isolation, but also this sequential formation of new places, new islands, there is high diversity. So once the species got in the first islands, some of them are now underwater, they are atolls. They speciate, then they move to another islands when the new islands were formed, and they speciate there. And of course, within each island, there are different habitat types, so they sometimes become multiple species in a single island. And this happened over and over every time different islands were formed. So Hawaii is now or had this highly diverse but also unique set of species. It was a laboratory of evolution, in fact. And some things were only found there. So one of the examples are these geese species, which colonized the islands early in the evolutionary history. And when they got there, essentially they speciate and became multiple species. And because there were not mammals on that island, they occupied niches that in other parts of the planet, they are occupied by mammals, like grazing. So the largest grazers on the island were geese. And so these were the species that once lived in this archipelago. And today, only one of them, Nene, this one here, is not extinct yet. And of course, when they get there, they start to feed on plants, and some of these plants, they develop traits or co-evolve with these animals and have traits adapted to be to the interaction of these animals. One example is this Diospirus, which has these large fruits with large seeds, which were likely dispersed by either some sort of geese or by other large animal, which is now extinct. So these plants left without a disperser. Another impressive radiation are the finches, which, like in Galapagos, they once colonized the archipelago, they speciate and fill different niches. So you have generalist finches, you have nectarivores, you have fruit and seed eaters, insectivores, and different kinds of insectivores. And of course, different groups of these animals, they establish co-evolutionary relationships with these plants. And for example, you have a set of plants which had long tubular corollas, which are clear adaptations to be pollinated by animals with long tongues or long bills in this case, right? And this likewise for other groups. So you have like parrot-like bills, you have like flower pierces, and so on. And among the plants, Hawaii has a very high diversity of lobeliads, the Campanulaceae family. And in this archipelago, they evolved very diverse life forms. So you had some that were canopy species or palm-like species which live in the cliffs. So you have understory, you have vines, and many of them have they were associated and dependent on animals, mutualist animals. For example, you can see here the phylogeny of lobeliads, and in red you have plants which have fruits, fleshy fruits, so fruits that are likely dispersed by some animal, because flesh fruits are dispersed by animals. So usually, you can see that nearly half of these species depend on animals to have the fruits consumed and the seeds dispersed. And it's similar to when we think about pollination. So in red here are plants dependent on birds. So most of the clades of lobeliads have association and dependence on birds to set fruits, right? And one example is Clermontia caciana here, what you can see that have these orange fruits that are like pumpkin shape, and they have small seeds and flesh fruits. And they also have these yellowy or whitish, greenish flowers that are also tubular. So this kind of, this plant in particular, as many others, it's not only pollinated by birds, but also dependent on birds. So you see that multiple species in this archipelago depend on animals to complete or to have more success completing their life cycles. And so this all implies in an archipelago highly diverse with that was isolated by a long time and developed these associations between, animals and plants depending on each other. And of course, because they were not invaded that often, they were pretty sensitive to invasion, or at least that's what we think today. So Hawaii is now considered the world's capital of extinctions and invasions. And these extinctions and invasions, they started with the Polynesians around 700 years ago and aggravated after James Cook found the islands at 1778. And to give you an idea of the impact that humans have had on the island, out of the 9% of the flora in Hawaii is endemic, of the plant species are endemic, and at least 9% are now extinct and 52% are endangered. And over 200 species have less than 50 individuals in the wild, so they are quite endangered. They are about to be extinct. And among the birds, so nearly all native passerines are extinct or near extinction, including at least 24 fruit-eating birds. So when we look at this graph, you see Hawaii, the number of birds extinct over the last 700 years in Hawaii in comparison to other places. And we can see that by far Hawaii is the place who had more species extinct, right? And of course, when this, not only when the Polynesians arrived and then later the Europeans arrived, and more recently with all this tourism happening in Hawaii, many organisms start being introduced, either accidentally or intentionally to, fill certain roles or as ornamental species planted in the gardens. Indeed, today we have what we can call a novel ecosystem, which is a place where most of the species are not native from that area. And so you have scenarios like this one. You get in certain places that look like kind of a lush, we could call it a lush tropical forest, where you can see big trees, canopy trees, like understory, epiphytes, herbs, shrubs, many kinds of plants, but sometimes none of those plants or animals that you see are native. So you have an entirely novel community. And of course, you have all an entire gradient from very invaded to less invaded ecosystem. But as you will see later, most have, there are no pristine forests in Hawaii anymore. And just to give you some examples here of all these plants that I collected fruit in one site, pretty much all of them are introduced. So you have here two kinds of passion fruit, strawberry guava, Chinus terebintifolius, Christmas tree, Clydenia. These two, I don't actually remember, but I think they are introduced too. And you have animals like the red-billed Laotrix, which from Asia. And so you have this new scenario that, despite being pretty sad for a biologist from a conservation standpoint, they are pretty interesting too, because they may represent what many places on Earth will become in the future. So we can use Hawaii to understand what other places on the planet may become if the extinction and introduction rates are as high as they have in Hawaii. So with this in mind, we set up this project where we went to 7 different sites on the Oahu Island, right? Everything I'm going to show, it's going to be from Oahu, which is the most populated island, where the capital, Honolulu, is. And we spread the 7 sites trying to cover the natural variation in rainfall, altitude, and the proportion of invasive species on the island. And in every site, we then, over 3 years, from I think 2013 on, we had mist netting happening every 7 weeks. So we set up these mist nets, we caught the birds, and we collect the fecal samples, and also set up game cameras, which were used these cameras were set up in front of plants to see which animals were consuming the fruits. So we caught over 3,000 fecal samples from 24 bird species. And from these samples, we identified over 100,000 seeds, viable seeds. So seeds that were not cracked, they were intact. So this means that they were probably being dispersed, right? So it's our proxy for seed dispersal. And we also use over 100,000 hours of footage. And with this information, we then were able to establish the link. So which bird is eating which plant and how frequent these interactions are, right? So we use this to build these networks and quantify a bunch of network metrics that indicate how complex interactions are in this ecosystem. And also for each bird and each plant present in our networks, we measure species level variables. For example, for birds, we measure biogeography, and for plants, we measure seed sizes. Also, for how long plants were fruiting and for how long birds were present in each site. Also, spatial distribution over the island and abundances. So we have species level data for pretty much all species that we sampled to. So just as a side note, because I'll be talking a lot about networks, I don't know if you all are familiar with these concepts. So I'll just give you some basic concepts. So imagine a community. Here you have like plants and pollinators, right? You have a bunch of animals and plants coexisting in a certain place, in a certain time, and you have to sample that to establish the interactions. So if you have, for example, this plant 2 being pollinated by animal C and B, you then have here plant 2 visited by B and C, right? So when you sample all plants in the community and all animals, you can build what we call a network. And this is a bipartite network where in one side, you have the plants, and the other side, you have the animals. And you don't have interactions within each trophic level. So here you don't have animals linked to animals or plants linked to plants, right? Of course, there are indirect interactions. They may be competing with each other within that trophic level, but this we're not considering here, right? Networks can be binary if you consider just the presence or absence of interactions, or they can be weighted if you have a measure of how frequent or how strong were interactions between two species. So if you have difference in thickness in these lines, this means that interactions are weighted. So this interaction, for example, is it's stronger than this one, right? And this is also a measure of dependence among species, right? So this plant here, for example, is more important for this bird than this one, which has a thin link. And two concepts we'll be hearing a lot are nestedness and modularity, which are two basic conformations that networks can have. So nestedness will occur when you have generalist species like these ones interacting with all the species in the network. Look at A, it's interacting with all the species here. While you have more specialist species, which only interact with generalists. So if you have this scenario happening both for animals and for plants, you have nestedness. And in this case, you have a core of generalist species strongly interacting with each other, while you never see or rarely see more specialized species interacting with each other. So this is a pattern that may emerge. And another common pattern is modularity, where you have a subset of plants interacting with a subset of animals, right? With very few or no interactions among these subsets. So we have the emergence of compartments or modules, right? So nestedness and modularity is something you'll be hear a lot in this talk. So first I'll give you, I'll show some descriptive results and then more quantitative results. So here you have a set of parameters that were measured for each network. And then I have here the regional, island level network, and here networks for each site. So each column here is a site except the first one, which is condensing information from all sites. So in general, we found 15 birds dispersing seeds of 44 plant species and establishing 112 links, different links. And we identified over 1,700 seed dispersal events. And seed dispersal event in this case is the presence of a viable seed in a fecal sample. 86% of the birds we detect are not native to Hawaii, and 65, almost 66% of the plants are also not native to Hawaii. And when we look at the local level, we have from 5 to 10 birds in each site feeding on fruits, and between 10 and 22 plants. And the number of links varied between 24 and 44. And I want to call your attention to these two sites where no native bird or native plant were interacting. So in this case, you have 100% of the species engaging in seed dispersal interactions being introduced. And the last invaded site, which is a mountaintop, still had 60% of the birds not native to Hawaii and 50% of the plants introduced to. And from all these 1,700 seed dispersal events we detected, 93% involved dispersal of introduced plants. So they were introduced seeds being moved around. And only 4% of the 4 events, or less than 1% of the events, involved native birds, which were these two species here, Apapane and Oahu amakihi, which, as you can tell by their bills, their bill morphology, they are not really frugivorous animals. They are more insectivorous or nectarivorous animals, and they just interact with a single plant species which has very small fruit, small seeds, and a very sweet fruit. So they were probably licking the juice from that plant and swallow some seeds, but that's not a very important interaction. And overall, there was no native bird interacting with a native plant, right? And this is essentially the pattern that we obtained for the network level network. So you remember that I told you about, I explained to you about nestedness. So we found that these networks, the network on Oahu is indeed nested. And it's also at the same time is modular. So we have 3 different subsets of species interacting with each other. And this is surprising because according to the theory, what we would expect for islands being colonized is low specialization, because when species get to islands, they tend to go through a process called niche broadening. So they eat what's available, right? So you would expect these networks to be super connected. So all birds eating fruits of all plant species, and all plant species being consumed by all birds. So you have no real structure in these networks, but instead we found that these networks are nested, right? So both niche broadening and interaction release is expected, but we didn't observe that. So this means that coevolution is not a necessary requirement for this complex network structure, which are found in native dominated communities, to emerge. But you can ask me, well, you are looking at the island level. What happened if you look at the site level? So at the site level, 6 out of our 7 sites were also modular, and none of them was nested. So we can also see that when we look at a different scale, there is niche partitioning, because modularity is an indication of niche partitioning, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have these subsets being formed, right? So again, when doesn't matter in which scale you look, you find certain level of specialization, which goes against the theoretical expectation of highly connectance or like less structured interactions in these islands. We also looked at interaction dissimilarity, and this essentially measures how different interactions are from one site to another, from one network to another. So for each one of our 7 sites, we compared the interactions we observed there. And this dissimilarity, they can occur for 2 reasons. So they can happen because the species are present in one site, but not in another. So if you have a partner with which you interact in one site, but not in another site, you will not interact with him in the second site, right? So this is one of the causes of this dissimilarity. And the other one is rewiring or partner switching. So if you have your partner in both sites, you interact with him in one site, but not in the other one. So this is rewire. It means that you change your preferred food, for example, right? So we quantify this for each one of our pair of sites. And we found that network dissimilarity, which varies from 0. So the networks are totally similar. They are exactly the same interactions, the same species, to 1, which would be the maximum dissimilarity. So the interactions are completely different in this case. And you see that interactions are in general very, the dissimilarities in general very high here, right? So it's above 50% in most cases. So it means that over 50% of interactions will be different between the pair of sites. And you see that also rewiring is pretty high, over 20% or around 25% is caused by rewiring. And this means that species are amazingly able to switch partners, as is expected for species that succeed invading, right? So good invaders, they should be able to switch partners. So if there is not one kind of food, you should go to another one, right? So again, that's an evidence that not only network complexity may emerge, but this is incredible because even though interactions change a lot from site to site, still you have the same interaction structure emerging in all places, which is pretty interesting. Okay, but then you can ask me, all right, Jeff, you are saying that the networks in Hawaii, they are similar to native dominated communities, but you didn't prove that. So we tried to prove this point. And here we have different network metrics, right? Both for binary metrics, right? When we just consider presence or absence of interactions. And here, a subset of metrics considering weighted network metrics. So when we consider interaction frequencies, right? We just did these two types of analysis just to make sure our analyses are robust. So we have here, so I assembled a data set with 42 networks from different parts of the planet. And for each one of these sites, I calculated these metrics, which are these blue intervals here. And then I compared these intervals for the native dominated communities from many places around the planet with the observed value of that metric for Oahu, for the 7 sites on Oahu. These are represented by gray. So what you have here is, if gray is overlapping the blue interval, it means that there is no difference in this metric in comparison to the metric from other networks, right? So as you can see here, in all instances, for all metrics measured, there is an overlap. This means that the networks on Oahu, they have the same structure than networks from other places in the planet, right? And this is true for nestedness, for modularity, and also for the robustness. I simulated the robustness of these networks. And robustness is essentially a measure of how fast a network falls apart when you have species sequentially removed. So the assumption of this analysis is, if you lose, if a plant, for example, lose all the birds that disperse the seeds, it should go extinct. That's the assumption. And the same for birds, right? So if someone lose all its partners, it will go extinct. And then you calculate how you iteratively in sequence remove species, simulate their extinction, and see how fast the network falls apart. So if there is high connectance, you will need to lose all partners in order for network to disappear, to fall apart completely. So this would be a highly robust network, right? And as you can see here, we have, again, an overlap. So networks, the novel network, seed dispersal networks in Oahu, they have similar robustness or similar stability, we can call, than networks in native dominated communities, right? And the same holds true for the structure of weighted networks. And then you can say, okay, Jeff, but in your data set, you have networks that come from tropical areas, non-tropical areas, or continents or islands, and they may be very different from what you have on Oahu. So you should take this into account. So what I did was to subset these islands. So I have here islands from both tropical and non-tropical areas, or just tropical islands and non-tropical islands, and then the same for continents. And as you can see here, the results hold true. In pretty much all instances, you still have network structure in those novel ecosystems of Oahu being similar to networks from other places on the planet, with two exceptions here, the weighted modularity and the complementary specialization in non-tropical continents. Okay, but overall, the big picture is not only the structure, but also the stability, the robustness to species loss in this seed dispersal in novel ecosystem look like native dominated communities. None of the communities in this data set had more than 50% introduced species, right? The ones I use to compare with the Oahu networks. So the take-home message from this first part is introduced birds are a double-edged sword for conservation, because you have most of the plants, the native plants, the only seed dispersers they have are the introduced animals. But 93% of the seeds dispersed are from introduced plant species. So this leaves you in a dilemma. And complex network structure does not require coexistence over long evolutionary time. Of course, you need the birds to have pre-adaptations to consume fruits, and the fruits to have traits of seed dispersal by animals in order for them to interact. But once you have this requirement filled, network complexity will emerge. So you don't need species to coexist over a long period of time in order for these patterns that are broadly described across many network types or in different parts of the planet to emerge. And we also found that interactions are highly variable across sites, which makes very peculiar that given this highly variability, network structure is still similar to native dominated communities. So this again means that species identity doesn't matter much, perhaps traits or something else. But what's shaping these networks is not the identity per se, it's something else that we'll talk in the next paper a little bit. And this also means that these birds are amazingly capable of switching the food resource they use. And at the same time, the plants are amazingly capable to switch the partners that they use to disperse their seeds. So this seems to be a very important characteristic for introduced species to succeed in these novel ecosystems. And interaction patterns in novel ecosystems are similar to those in native dominated communities, as I stressed a lot already. So now we are going to talk about the second paper. So far I was talking about more the community level structure of these interactions, and I was not really paying attention to who were the species and who were the most important species. And that this is what we did in the next paper. Essentially, we wanted to know who are the most important species and why they are important. So we looked at the traits related to their importance for network structure. So here we have, just to illustrate, we have a red-whiskered bulbul, which is a bird from Asia, feeding on lobelia, a native and endangered lobelia. So it's an introduced bird interacting with a native plant. And our first question was, who are the most important birds? So if I compare the main introduced birds and with the native, the only two native birds, who are more important? So here you can see these histograms for the different sites. And what we have here is that, as expected, the introduced birds they had higher normalized degrees. So normalized degree is a measure of how many partners available in the community you are interacting with, right? So the higher this bar, the more partners a bird had, the more plant species it was dispersing. And as you can see here, the shades of blue all indicate that introduced birds were more important. And again, the proportion of samples with seeds, most of these seeds that we found on fecal samples were in the fecal samples from these introduced animals. Just a tiny bit here. These 4 events I talked to you earlier were from native animals. And what about plants? So we did the same thing for plants. We took the 3 most commonly consumed plants and the 3 most frequently consumed native species. And again, yellow, orange, and red are usually the largest bars here. So these plants, the introduced plants, are more commonly, more often consumed by a large number of introduced by animals. So their role for the connectivity in these networks, because normalized degree essentially is translated into connectivity, these plants, the introduced species, are more important than the native. And indeed, when you look the proportion of seeds found in the fecal samples, you again have all the introduced species being much more frequent than the native here, the native species, which is not surprising. What's interesting to note here is sites like Tantalus, where we have more active management. You have species like Pipterus albidus and Clermontia caciana being as important for network connectivity as the introduced species. So this may be indicating that management works. So we can improve the importance of a species for network connectivity. And before earlier, I was talking to you about modularity. So when you have a modular network like this one, that's a hypothetical network here, just to explain the idea for you. So you have here the plants, the animals, and you have two subsets, this first module of interactions and this second module here. And you can classify species according to their roles for this network structure, right? So you can have a module hub, which is a species which is very important for the connectivity within the module, like species A here, but not very important for the connectivity among modules. Or you can have a network hub, right? Which is a species which is important for both things, for the connectivity within and among modules. Or you can have a connector, which is a species that is not really important for connectors within its own module, but it's important to connect different modules, right? Or you can have a peripheral, which is a species that just establishes a few interactions. And once you assign a value for the among module connectivity and the within module connectivity, you can classify these species according to these four roles. And so we did this for birds, and we found there was no bird acting as a module hub, and the only bird acting as a network hub was an introduced bird. So the only native birds are this one in bold and underlined, right? So the only native birds here are playing peripheral roles, while the most important roles, which is natural network hub and connectors, were played by introduced species. And what about plants? So the same general trend. Here we have, again, native species are underlined and in bold. And so you can see again that module hubs are only introduced species playing this role. Same thing for network hubs. And most of the connector roles as connector played in this network is played by introduced species. But here you have species like Pipterus albidus, which is native, and Sidrax odorata, which are playing also a relatively important role. So still in some communities, you have plants, native plants that can somewhat play key roles for network modularity, right? But the most important roles like network hubs and module hubs are still played by introduced species. So this means that losing such species may have a more important impact on the network structure. And what about the importance of these different traits that species have? So why some species have higher normalized degree or high contribution to nestedness or high importance for among or within module connectivity. So we calculate these metrics for each bird and each plant, and for the regional scale, and then later I will show for the local scale. And what we found was the following, just the big picture, right? So here it's the beta estimate. So it means like the far one of these points is from the zero. It means the more important that variable was in its association with the response variable, which is here. So for example here, and another thing, if it's above zero, you have a positive influence. And if it's below, like here, you have a negative influence, right? A negative association. So for normalized degree, so the birds who were more that had a higher contribution to normalized degree, they had high degree of frugivority. So they were a higher proportion of their diets was composed by fruits, right? And they also had large ranges. And it didn't matter how abundant they were and how big was the gape width in this case, right? And again, for the other metrics, you had, again, degree of frugivority being important. And the importance of a species for within module connectivity was related to the gape width. So the smaller the gape width, the less important the species will be to connect the species within its own module, right? And for plants, we had normalized degree associated with abundances. So the more abundant was a species, the more partners it tended to have. And the smaller the fruit also, the more partners it had. The other variables were not really important, except lipids. So plants rich in lipids also had interactions with more partners. And overall, we have a kind of similar picture. It's more complex, but again, the contribution to nestedness was related to abundances and seed sizes. And the contribution to within module connectivity was related to the range. So the more the species widespread over the island, the more it contributes to the connection within its module. And when we look at the local scale, so only to each site separately, actually every site was analyzed independently, but all sites were put together in this big model. So because we were able to use only binary data, so no weighted networks this time, we only calculated this for normalized degree. So how many, what's the proportion of partners and species had? So for birds, we had here that the proportion of partners a bird had was related to the degree of frugivority. Again, so the more frugivorous a bird was in a particular site, the more partners it had, and the smaller its gape width, the less fruits it was able to disperse. And for plants, you had that the longer was the fruiting duration, the more partners the plant had, and likewise for the amount of lipids, so the proportion of lipids in the fruits. So the more lipids, the more dispersers a plant will have, which is, there's a recent study showing that this is probably related to how frugivorous the birds are. So birds that are not strictly frugivorous, they tend to consume or to favor fruits that are more lipid rich. And again, seed sizes was negative related to normalized degree. So the smaller the seeds, the less, the more important, the more partners, more seed dispersers a plant will have, right? And this, it's interesting to note that these things, despite the complex scenario, you have these parameters are the ones that are known to be important for how much a species contribute to the structure of native dominated seed dispersal networks too. So the mechanisms underlying the interactions here in Hawaii or in Oahu, they are also similar to what we know to be important in other places, right? And you have this complex combination of niche-based processes, which are more related to constraints imposed by morphology or nutritional content to interactions, than the random chances of encounter, like abundances. However, depending on the scale you analyze, abundance will be, or fruit availability or partners availability in the landscape will also be important, right? So the more places you are and the more abundant you are, the higher the chance you have to be important in a community. So the take-home message for this part is that essentially introduced species took over most of the core roles in the network. And Oahu is an example of ecological meltdown, which is essentially this idea that you have mutualistic partners that are introduced favoring each other. So the more introduced plants you have, the more the introduced animals will engage with those plants, and the more introduced or invade or modified this ecosystem will be. So it's hard to come back from that point once the ecological meltdown starts. It's important to note that large-seeded plants are dispersal limited. So many of the plants that are endangered in Hawaii, they have large seeds. They were adapted to be dispersed by large animals that were that are now extinct. So they still are dependent on human-mediated seed dispersal, right? So this is a problem to solve. And native species have secondary importance, but as we show, restoration may enhance their roles, right? Because like in a restored site, we had a higher importance of native plants, right? Where in these restored sites, essentially what happens is the important introduced species are removed, the ones that are known to be highly consumed by birds, and they are replaced by native species, right? And again, the process known to define roles, the species roles in native dominated communities also matter in novel ecosystems. So it seems that the processes underlying the similarities may also be important. They also matter in these novel ecosystems. And this is important because it may allow us to start thinking about how these networks are assembled and how to control their assembly process, the assembly of these networks. And we also found that traits associated with important roles may guide restoration. For example, we know that fruits or plant species with longer fruiting duration and with smaller seeds, they tend to play key roles in these networks. So in this scenario, we can try to find native species with those traits and outplant there more in order to entice the birds to consume more of these plants and then have them being more dispersed and then perhaps making this place more wild, increase the proportion of native species in that community. Likewise for birds, so we know that bird gapes are important. In this case, probably if you want to have this large planted plants, the plants with large seeds being dispersed, we should consider perhaps to find the largest native animal capable of consuming those seeds and work on perhaps introduction or something like that to have these plants being dispersed and then the ecosystem being self-sustainable, right? So this is pretty much what I had to show. I hope you liked, and if you have comments or questions, please feel free to ask or send me. Thank you very much.